Scott. I'm your host, Scott Cunningham. I'm a professor at Baylor University in our economics department in Waco, Texas. And before I tell you about this week's guest, as just those of you who's never listened to this podcast before, this podcast is dedicated to listening to the personal stories of living economists and to creating a patchwork-like quilt that contains many stories that add up into the broader story of the profession over the last 50 years. I believe people need stories to navigate their historical lives. What better stories than the personal stories of real economists as they share their own paths with us? Today's guest is a luminary in labor economics with a career that spans several decades at Princeton, as well as MIT before that. Dr. Henry Farber, the Hughes-Rogers Professor of Economics at Princeton University. A little bit about Dr. Farber that I've written down here. His major research contributions span a lot of subjects as broad as the behavior of unions, arbitration systems, wage setting, employer-employee matching, and labor supply. His early work studied union bargaining behavior, and that's a lot of the things that people associate with Dr. Farber is his lifelong work on unions. I don't want to spoil how he got interested in that, but it was a lot of his early life experiences growing up in New Jersey. His research has been very impactful, not just in economics, though, but also in psychology, sociology, legal studies, and political science. And within economics, he's a student of Dr. Orley Ashenfelter, who's been on the show before. And what's interesting is that in many ways, Dr. Farber kind of predates that credibility revolution that kind of comes to Princeton. He went to grad school at Princeton, kind of comes a little bit after him. He's known for a lot of his work in labor doing applied theory, structural modeling, and sophisticated econometric analysis. And a lot of the work he's known for is both, as I said, trade unions, but also more recently, the labor supply of taxi drivers to kind of help shed some light on the empirical relevance of these neoclassical models that we've all learned and their empirical relevance for worker behavior versus behavioral economic models. So today we're going to delve into Dr. Farber's incredible career, his contributions to labor, and his own personal journey. I hope you find this conversation as insightful and as inspiring as I did. As always, thank you for supporting the podcast, and I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Farber and myself now. Well, it's a pleasure to have on here legend labor economist, Dr. Henry Farber. Henry, thank you so much for being on the show.
Thank you for having me, Scott.
For the sake of the listener, can you tell us your full title, the long, and if it's long, give us the long version, and who pays your paycheck?
Okay, two things. My title currently is Hughes-Rogers Professor of Economics, Emeritus, Princeton University. I don't receive a paycheck because I'm emeritus. And for many years, of course, I did receive a paycheck from the universities I was employed by.
Oh, okay. But that looks like the video looks like a Princeton office. Is that are you at the office right now?
I am. I'm very lucky to have the industrial relations section here, which as long as I'm still active, though I had to move to a smaller office, which is fine with me. Yeah. And I'm very comfortable here. I see my friends and colleagues and talk to students and so on. I just don't get paid, don't have responsibility to teach or any of that.
Yeah, yeah. So you've been, how long have you been emeritus?
Since September.
Oh,
so less than a year.
Oh, okay. Okay. Well, I'll save my questions about that for the end. Well, so can you just we can start with an icebreaker. What's a vacation that you've been on that maybe it's not your favorite vacation, maybe it's not the worst one, but you've noticed that over your life, you've thought about that vacation a couple of times. It's left like a bit of an impression on you.
Well, there's been many trips. My wife is an inveterate traveler. She likes to travel more than I do, I think. But I I had, we all telescope the past, but recent past, we took a trip early in 2023 that was delayed by 3 years because of the pandemic
Mm.
to the Galapagos.
Oh,
And that was simply astounding, followed
oh,
by 4 or 5 days in the Andes in Ecuador that were, it was just incredible. And I've, in other dimensions, one of my avocations is motorcycle riding. I use a motorcycle for transportation, but I've taken some memorable, for me at least, motorcycle trips around mostly the eastern part of the United States, down the Blue
mm.
Ridge Parkway, you know, as far as Georgia and South Carolina. Well, the Blue Ridge doesn't go to Georgia and South Carolina, but down that way to the Ozarks, up
Mm.
into Canada. We took a great trip in Quebec, north of the St. Lawrence, to the Hydro-Quebec power facility at Manic-Sank, it's called, which is probably about 150 kilometers from Labrador City. And
Wow.
these have all been amazing trips.
Oh, that sounds amazing. Wait, when you did your bike, you did your motorcycle trip, were you by yourself or was it with some buddies?
Now, the biggest trips I've taken are with my brother, actually.
Oh,
And
oh,
and I have to say, there's an interesting life cycle story here because I also would ride with my two of my children ride, and they would ride with me. But they're now in a point in life where they're raising young children and so on. So it's really just me and my brother.
oh. What kind of bike are you taking on a long trip like that?
Well, right now I ride what's called the Triumph Tiger,
Yeah.
um, which is a nice machine. Not they made Tigers in the 50s and 60s, which would leak all the oil out as you went around the block. These are
Uh-huh.
newer machines, more modern, anti-lock brakes, traction control, fuel
Yeah.
injection. So
Yeah. I get on Bring a Trailer a lot and I've made a bid a couple of times on a Triumph. I think it's a Steve McQueen edition. Is that right? Am I thinking of the right bike? Steve McQueen.
probably yes. He rode Triumphs in his
It was like a
what?
special edition, maybe, or something. It was
Yeah,
named.
I'm not familiar. I'm not familiar with that.
Oh, okay. Well, I'll have to send you, and you can
Do you
tell me.
ride a motorcycle?
No, that was going to be the initiation.
Right.
Was getting
My
that.
only advice to you, if you're starting motorcycling,
Yeah.
start small,
Uh-huh.
really, and then as you get more comfortable, if you want something bigger, get it. Don't start with some monster machine.
Don't get like a big Easy Rider where you get
Well,
the.
don't ever get one of those. But
uh. So, do you have a bike that you ride for a long trip like that? That's different from the one you go to and from Princeton?
I have three motorcycles. The Triumph, which is my go-to bike, it's the only really modern one.
Yeah.
The other two are quite old BMWs, 30 and 40 plus
Yeah.
years rather old. And one I like to ride just around town is currently waiting for some tender loving care.
Oh, yeah. What's wrong with it? It's got a little trouble.
It's leaking oil out of places it shouldn't leak oil.
Yeah, I've heard that's probably not. I heard you probably shouldn't drive those too much. That's great. Well, so where did you grow up?
I grew up not far from Princeton, actually, in a town in New Jersey called Linden, which
Oh,
is really a prototype of an old industrial town. My hometown, as I was growing up in it, had a General Motors assembly plant, an Esso oil refinery, an American Sadimid chemical plant, a public service electric generation utility facility, a coffee factory, a Gordon's gin distillery, and I'm just barely scratching the surface here.
huh.
So really growing up there made me what I am in terms of professionals and so forth.
What do you mean? Why are all those things having a big impact on you?
Well, it it was a yeasty place with regard to the industry, and the industry to me was always fascinating. One of my highlights of my youth was taking a visit with the Cub Scouts or the Boy Scouts to the General Motors assembly plant and getting a tour. I thought, I was kind of like a boy scientist engineer kind of kid, and
Mm,
it was just absolutely fascinating.
mm,
In addition, my interest in labor unions, which is a defining interest of my professional career, really came out of growing up in Linden for those reasons and some others, which I could tell you about.
What were you noticing about unions and workers as a little kid in that town?
Well, the town was really a working class Catholic, mostly Catholic community with a lot of, uh, Central and Eastern European immigrants, like Hungarians and Poles and so on. And so these were the defining kids in the schools, in the public school I went to. But importantly, my father ran a small business. He ran a building supply business that I spent an awful lot of time working in as a child, starting when I was very young, packaging nails into 1 pound paper bags for customers from 50
Mm,
and 100-pound kegs.
mm.
And my dad had a union in his place, the Teamsters, Local 522. And he never said a bad word about the union. It was just a fact of life. But I spent a lot of time once I became a teenager working in the yard with the unionized folk, with the truck drivers, with the loaders, with the stockers, those sort of people.
Yeah.
And they were amazing people, and the union was important to them. And I just soaked that up to the point where, but I was my father's son. So once there was a wildcat strike that the workers called over a contentious disciplinary decision, and I was a strike breaker. I'll admit, but yeah, a number of years later, when I graduated college without real direction of what I was going to do, I called the union business agent for the local 522 and said, Willie, I need some work. And he said, okay, show up at this lumber yard on Monday morning. And I showed up there and I worked, and I wound up a few shortly after at another warehouse with the Teamsters Union. I was a forklift operator loader for
Mm.
them. And we had the company did a contentious disciplinary thing, and I became a striker.
Oh,
So
that was your first time?
yeah, striking. Yes. So I've been on both sides of this.
Yeah.
And eventually, I've always been interested in unions. When I was in the 10th grade in high school, I wrote a big report on Dave Beck, who was an early leader of the Teamsters, not early, so early, but mid 20th century, just prior to the Jimmy Hoffa
Right.
era in the Teamsters Union. And so I was certainly motivated, and did another report where I interviewed the president of the union local that my father had. My dad arranged that. They were on, first name basis, the unions and the employers.
Mm.
And we had a long conversation about what the union did for the workers, how it operated, and so on. And I learned a ton.
You had a lot of affection. Is that the right word? Affection for the union, like respect for the union, or how would you have described it?
Well, I think I came to absorb the role that the workers perceived the unions played in their life.
Yeah.
I grew up my mother was politically rather liberal.
Hmm.
Uh, to put it in context for your older listeners, we were subscribers to something called the I.F. Stone's Weekly.
Uh-huh.
Uh, Israel Stone, I.F. Stone, was a left wing commentator in Washington who had a newsletter that was maybe not quite far enough left to get him in trouble with McCarthy, but
Uh,
was out there. And I also, I was always taught to worry about people less fortunate than we were. We were sort of solidly comfortable, not rich, certainly at all. My father's business eventually went bankrupt. But it, I was just always interested. I can't even describe it. I could tell you my intellectual journey and how I got from there to where I am. But
mm.
if you want to hear that, I can talk
I,
about that.
I do want to hear it. I was maybe that's a thread that we can keep going. Well, when you were younger, before you sort of began getting jobs, what kind of kid were you? What kind of games and what could I have found you doing in the summer or on the weekends?
Well, I was sort of boy science nerd. I mean, I love science. I thought I was going to be an engineer. I was sure of that. I love to
Huh.
build things. I love to do electronics. And this is in the days when electronics was vacuum tubes.
Oh,
Um, and I I'll tell a story. I can tell a very personal story if you want that.
yeah.
Um, I'm Jewish, and at my bar mitzvah, the reception was at our house, and the caterers brought the desserts packed in dry ice. Now, dry ice is frozen carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide at normal pressure has no liquid state. It goes right from a solid to a gas. And I received the science kit as a gift. And one of the things you should build was called an atomic cloud chamber. And to do that, you needed a radium source, which emits alpha particles, and you can track these alpha particles in a cloud of dry ice. So I left my bar mitzvah party to go down the basement and build my atomic cloud chamber. That's the kind of kid I was.
Was your mom and dad, were they surprised or that like exactly what they expected you to be doing at your bar mitzvah?
I would say they never even noticed I was gone.
That's really interesting. Who do you think you got that from? Are you getting that kind of thing from your dad or your mom, or do you see scientists in your family?
My mom was sort of anti-scientific. My dad was like a really smart guy who understood how things worked, but
Mm,
I think I just self-generated it. I was always reading. I
mm,
was always going to the library, which by luck was half a block from my house, and
mm.
looking I knew in the Dewey Decimal System where the books I was interested in were.
Yeah.
And I don't, I'm kind of the only one in my family who's like that. There's two people in the world who I know think like me. One is my brother. He's
Mhm.
younger than I am, and one is my older son. Um,
Oh,
thinks they my all my kids think like me a bit, but it's they're we're all very different in
yeah.
important ways. But uh, I can't really say I got it from anyone in particular. I was lucky that my parents were supportive of it.
Yeah.
You know,
Well, what kind of, so when you were, so you wanted to be an engineer. My
yes,
next question was, what did you want to be when you grew up? And you wanted to be an engineer when you were what, like even so like teenager.
yes. If you were to ask me what I was going to be, I would say I'd be an engineer.
Oh, did you know any engineers as role models? Were there role
No,
models?
no. The point is, I thought I wanted to be this without knowing what an engineer was.
Ah, okay.
And I certainly had never seen, I grew up in a town without PhDs,
Right.
it was a working class town, really.
Mm-hmm.
And if there's a very well known book that I only discovered after graduate school, actually, called Schooling in Capitalist America
Mm.
by Sam Bowles and Herb Gintis.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
It's a terrific book which talks about how different schools shape people to be fill in particular roles in the production process, workers,
Um,
managers, etc.
yeah.
And when I first read it, I said, "Oh, I don't know." But then I thought about growing up in Linden, and I
Yeah.
realized that my high school was meant to train people for that production part of the production process,
Right.
and it it really was quite interesting. But I was sure I wanted to be an engineer.
Oh, oh. Yeah, I've never read that book, but I've seen it. I know Sam Bowles is famous for it, but now that you've said that, I'm gonna get it. So then you go to high school in
Yeah,
this town. How big was it? How big was your high school?
we graduated 550 a year.
550 a year in your class. So it was 550.
Yes, about 550. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Okay. Well, so what kind of classes? So you're, a teenager, you're wanting to be an engineer. So what kind of classes are you like really having a great time in that you're responding well to?
Well, our high school didn't have all that rich a course offering. I
Yeah.
mean, I think there were probably two AP classes in the whole high school, one in world history and one in calculus. And I did take the one in calculus. I took all the math they offered. I took 4 years of high school science. I didn't really thought, to my regret, I didn't focus on languages.
Mm,
But there wasn't all that much option. It was a fairly set curriculum.
yeah.
Each year it was a course in math. Each year it was a course in science. Each year was a course in English. Each year was a course in history or social
Yeah.
studies.
Hmm.
And that was really it.
Yeah.
Uh,
And
you
are
know,
you deepening your love for science as the years go on the whole time?
yes, I was, unshakable in this till I went to college,
Mm.
so
So your teachers, they saw you and they were like, yeah, Henry Farber, he's going to be an engineer, or did they have another impression of you?
I don't, it's interesting you say that. I don't think that they had much of an impression of me one way or another. I wasn't much trouble. As my mother would say, Hank was never any trouble.
Yeah.
And public school teachers often, focus on the kids who are asking for attention. And I wasn't really asking for attention. My high school chemistry teacher thought I was a bit of a clown and was rather surprised that I did really well on the chemistry achievement test. He said, I don't know how you did that, but um, I was a pretty low profile.
Okay. Okay. So then you graduate and you go to, and I can't pronounce it very well. How do you say that?
Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute.
It's yeah. So because you're going to a school that's going to specialize in training an engineer. You're
That's
going,
correct. And I don't think I had enough self-confidence, and no one in the school was pushing me to say, try to go to MIT or someplace like that. I mean,
mm,
RPI is a terrific school. It's a serious engineering school, in the next tier below a place like MIT.
yeah. Yeah.
And I went to RPI.
And that's where is that? Is that in New York?
It's in Troy, New York, near
Yeah.
Albany.
Okay. So what happens there? Because you end up, you go in and what's your major when you get there?
I was an engineer. You didn't have to choose the kind of engineering immediately. And once you declare you're going to be an engineer, which most of the students at RPI did, again, your curriculum was pretty well set.
Mm,
You had as freshman, you had a course in math, a course in chemistry, a course in physics, a course in engineering drawing back in the day,
mm,
and one humanities elective, which I took a philosophy class.
uh-huh,
Uh, but understand this was 1968, right in
mm,
the heart of the Vietnam War era.
yeah.
And that's what and I did fine in engineering. It really, for me, was no trouble at all. I really kind of liked it, but I thought I wanted to do something that was more relevant to people. And I think it was
Mm,
a misapprehension on my part that engineering couldn't really be that relevant to people. But
mm.
I decided to explore a bit the social sciences. So
That's coming out of the political tension at the time, the war
I
and the
believe
Cultural
so.
Revolution.
Who knows really,
Yeah.
but I think that's my reading of what happened to me. I kind of want to think more about people than devices.
Right, right, right. So you start exploring the social sciences because you're interested. Are you interested in public policy? Is that why you're looking at it, or
I don't
what?
think I thought about public policy per se. I've always been sort of model oriented, and which is kind of
Oh,
how I got drawn to economics.
yeah.
Economics had an underlying model of behavior, and it most easily allowed me to transfer my mathematical skills
Mm,
compared to some of the others. Plus, don't forget, RPI is an engineering school, and the social science departments are really just service departments for the engineers and the scientists who are there,
yeah.
uh, which is both bad because it's small and good because when the faculty sees a student who's actually really interested in their subject, I got a lot of personal
Oh, yeah.
attention. I remember playing chess with my teachers and stuff like that, and
Right, right.
it was good. Plus, I had a brother-in-law who was an economist who's about
Oh,
almost 20 years, 17 or 18 years older than me.
oh.
And he's an economist. He's 90 now. But he also was a valuable springboard for advice for me.
So in college, was he a professor?
He was an assistant professor at Penn State and eventually left the government and was in the antitrust division of the Justice Department.
Oh,
And he went to Columbia to get a PhD back in the day when Columbia was really a top department. I mean, a seriously top department.
yeah.
Um,
Was he there when
and,
Becker was there?
oh, before Becker, I
Before
think.
Becker, because Becker's there in the late 60s, right?
Yeah, he was there before then.
Oh, okay.
And he, so we didn't always agree on a lot of things, but he gave me important advice at particular points in my professional career life, early professional life that were useful.
So you could have taken, you didn't have to take an econ class, did you? You
Where
chose it at RPI? You could
Yeah,
have
in
done like,
fact, I became interested in economics, and I've never actually taken a principles of economics class. I jumped right into intermediate classes, which
mm,
is ironic given I've taught principles of economics both at MIT and at Princeton for many years.
oh,
Um, and so I just jumped right in with an intermediate level class in micro. We used the first edition of Henderson and Quant, which
oh,
which is a wonderful book. And Richard Quant is still alive, and he's here in Princeton, and I have lunch or dinner with him um, on a semi-regular basis. So
wow.
uh, anyway, it's so the intellectual journey. You kind of fall into things, and you just have to take advantage of what you fall into, and that's kind
Yeah,
of what happened to me.
yeah,
I was fishing around for something to study. Should I study math? Well, math majors are really born, not made. I was thinking about being a structural engineer, a mechanical engineer, an electrical engineer. But eventually I wound up in economics and I really haven't looked back.
yeah, yeah. So, do you remember any single professor while you were at RPI that left like a bit of a mark on you?
Yes, because they were willing to talk to me like I knew something. There was a guy named Ramesh Dewan, who I actually was an RA for and did a little my first statistical work
Uh-huh.
um, was in sort of macro development with him. But statistical work then involved, punch cards
Yeah.
and mainframe computing and very
Mm,
small amounts of data, really. So I
right.
didn't do too much. I can't remember the project really, but he made it. He certainly made an impression on me.
Mm. So you are getting towards the end of your time at RPI. And so what do you want to be when you grow up, kind of like rising senior year?
I had no idea.
Really?
Um, I was working in the summer for my father. I was earning money for college. I thought about getting a job in a clothing store in the town I was living in. And eventually, as I described earlier, I got a job working in a lumber warehouse, driving a forklift.
Uh-huh.
And that was really important. I had no clear idea. I didn't know what a professor did, really. I didn't.
Mm-hmm.
And after 6 or 9 months of that, waking up at 5 every morning to be there at 6, I said, there must be an easier way for a smart Jewish kid to earn a living than doing this. And I said, I'm interested in unions. Let me go
Mm.
study unions. And I'd heard somehow, somewhere, that Cornell had a school of industrial labor relations. So I applied to a master's program there.
Oh, I missed that on your Vita. So you do a master's at Cornell?
I did a master's in the ILR school at Cornell, and that was
Oh,
absolutely critical because that's where I found myself.
what happened?
Well, I went to Cornell in January of 1973,
Okay.
and I was for that time more technically prepared than their usual student.
Mm.
So I was able to land a really good um, research assistantship with
Mm.
a professor there named David Lipsky, who became the dean of the ILR school a number of years later. And my first published paper is a co-authored paper with him on
Mm.
strikes in the construction industry.
Oh.
But I when I was like a pig in slop when I discovered data, really discovered data analysis. And oh my God, what a window on the world.
Ah.
And I fell into it. And after doing, the master's, I was there for 18 months, got a master's degree in industrial and labor relations, took courses in collective bargaining, in human resource management, in labor economics. I took the PhD courses in the economics department. And I really enjoyed it. And it came time, I said, I think I like what these professors do. I want to get a PhD. And I just loved living in Ithaca.
Mm.
But here's where my brother-in-law comes in. He said, don't be an idiot. Go to the best graduate program you can get into. And so that caused me to apply a little bit more broadly to graduate school. And I decided I wanted to go into economics because industrial and labor relations is kind of an interdisciplinary endeavor. And I convinced myself that I was better apt to make progress understanding unions from a particular disciplinary perspective rather than from an interdisciplinary perspective. And I'd already sort of chosen economics, so I chose to go in.
Wait, so there was a major, you could have gotten a doctorate in ILR? Industrial IRL?
I would have gotten a PhD. They do give doctorates. I would have gotten a PhD from Cornell's economics department.
Oh, okay. I thought you were saying you were thinking about this non-econ PhD.
No, well, I was thinking first about a non-econ PhD. Then I decided to do economics. Then the question is, where do I do economics?
Right.
So the easiest thing would be to stay at Cornell. My brother-in-law said, don't do that.
Yeah.
Cornell was an okay economics department, but it wasn't of the caliber of the best.
Yep.
And then something very fateful happened for me. Did you want me to go into that?
Yeah, I want to hear it.
I met Orley Ashenfelter. Basically, I was reading his papers and I said, oh my God, this is who I want to be. And this is not his papers on program evaluation. This is his earlier work. I was interested in unions. In particular, I found a paper in the 1969 or 68 or 69, I think 69 AER called Trade Unions, Bargaining Theory, and Industrial Strike Activity.
Oh.
That just blew me away with George Johnson. He co-wrote this with George Johnson. And it was like, oh my God, he's thinking about a model, an actual model, an economic model you can bring to the data of how unions behave.
Yeah.
And I collected my own data. Actually, I got the data from Dan Hammermesh that was Orley and George had written a paper where they used aggregate data on wages and so on. And I was able to get data through Dan on individual collective bargaining agreements and whether there was a strike and how long it was and all that stuff. And I re-estimated the Ashenfelter-Johnson model with micro data.
Yeah. And
I had such a good time. To plug myself, that paper eventually wound up in the AER, but it blew me away. And then Orley came to give a talk at Cornell. The graduate students had invited him, and I managed to sit next to him at dinner and introduce myself. And I said I'd applied to Princeton, and he said, "No, that's good. Who knows?" And he said, "Send me your paper," which I did. And he apparently
the one. This is the paper that you're gonna that was similar to his, based on his work. You were telling him about it. He says he wants to see it.
Yeah. Okay. So I sent it to him, and I got into the graduate program. I think he had something to do with that. I applied to 2 PhD programs other than Cornell, one at MIT, one at Princeton. I didn't get into MIT, which was okay. I eventually, I can show it to you. It's somewhere in my office. I have my rejection letter from the MIT graduate program.
Okay.
Framed because I had it on the wall of my office when I was a professor at MIT.
Right. Was MIT a better place for labor?
No.
Than Princeton?
Absolutely not. Not at the time. It had some good people, but no, it wasn't. I mean, to my eye, I say absolutely not. Orley was like a god in my eye.
Was that a widespread opinion throughout the whole profession that Orley was in the 70s really was spectacular labor economist?
Well, that he was very good. He was very young then. In 1973, Orley was maybe 31 or 32.
Hmm.
But, I was ignorant. I had never firsthand experienced Jacob Mincer or
Mm.
Gary Becker or those people. So saying that Orley was the absolute star is wrong, I think.
Yeah.
You
Okay.
know, but he was clearly an up and comer, and he was just the guy I wanted to work with. So I went
Yeah.
to Princeton, very in a very excited um, frame of mind.
Does your paper that you use the micro data with, does it contradict anything that he had found, or what's the difference between the two papers? Well, he had aggregate data, but he had that model. What do you end up finding?
Well, I did. I mean, I did two things. I recast the model in a way that I think Orley would admit is cleaner, um, and then I was actually able to estimate the. Basically, there's a piece. I don't even remember exactly Orley's empirical work in that paper, Orley and George's empirical work, but they used the model to motivate the empirical work. I actually estimated a structural version of their theoretical model with the
Oh,
microdata.
okay.
So it doesn't contradict what they did, it supplements what they
Got
did.
it. Got it. Got it.
Okay. There's a concept in the model called a union concession schedule, which is a plot of how the union minimum acceptable wage demand falls as the strike goes on. You
Oh.
you can find a version of this in Hicks' theory of wages. Um,
Oh.
and I was able to estimate the rate at which the wage demands decline with
Oh.
the data and so on. So,
Oh, that's cool. You worked on that at Cornell as a master's student?
yes, and then
Wow.
continued it when I first arrived in Princeton. Yeah.
Wow. So you get there and help me understand. You're at Princeton and then there's this industrial relations section. Imagine I've never heard of the industrial relations section and I'm like from another, but I know what an economics department is. What is it about it that is so distinct and different but related to Princeton? What is the section?
Well, well formally, and I think one of your other you've had other interviewees
Yeah.
who spent time here.
Mm-hmm.
Section means a section of the library.
Mm.
And we were housed in the main library, Firestone Library at Princeton. And before Firestone was built in 1948, we were housed in a building called Chancellor Green, which was the library at that time. The section goes back to the early 1920s. We just had our 100th anniversary
Mm.
a year or two ago, and it was an independently endowed group in the early days focused mainly on labor management relations, but from an economics perspective. So it was in the economics, it's always been administratively under the economics department,
Mm-hmm.
at least always, at least for half a century.
Is this
Uh,
before the econ department, right? It's like
well,
50 years.
I don't really know the exact timing. The economics department was a combined department with like sociology and so on way back. And I don't, to be honest, I'm not, I know I look old, but I'm not quite that old um, to know the exact timing of all that. But basically, in the modern incarnation, it's a research group within the economics department focused on labor issues,
Mm-hmm.
uh, and is lucky to have some independent funding,
Mm-hmm.
um, and is it's a community, it's a very collegial environment, and the arc of my career that brought me back here is really a testament to how attractive it is to be in the industrial relations section in Princeton.
Well, so you were you immediately drawn to working with Orley Ashenfelter, or is that like a gradual process?
I would say all it took for me was to read that paper.
Uh-huh.
I mean, when I said this is the kind of thing I want to do,
Yeah.
and I was lucky. So taking serendipity is important. So being
Yeah.
able to sit with Orly at dinner at Cornell in 1970, probably the spring of 74,
Mm.
and talk with him and introduce myself to him and let him know I was interested in the kind of thing he did was, I think, important for me. And, life is a series of accidents. So my brother-in-law telling me, don't be an idiot, go to the best program you can go to.
Yeah.
Running across Orly's paper. I don't even remember how I found it.
Mm.
And he'd written other papers as well, but nothing that hinted at the causal inference work that he ultimately became really well known for.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, who were some of your classmates? And what year are you arriving there? It's like 70, you said 74 at Cornell. So is it like 74, 75 you get there?
Princeton, you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah, I got to Princeton in the fall of 74, so it'll be 50
Okay.
years ago this fall. And the class of 18 students had 6 labor economists in it.
Oh, wow.
Um, one of whom is Jan Svejnar, who's a pretty well-known guy who's a 1968 Czech refugee who went to Cornell as an undergrad. I actually met him at Cornell, and we went to graduate school at Princeton together. I
Uh-huh.
just talked to him on the phone yesterday.
Mm.
Another is a guy named Randy Filer, who's at Hunter College in New
Mm.
York. One, two, three. Uh, I'm not sure I kept track of all. One's a guy named Paul Bennett, who was at the New York Fed for a long time and eventually became chief economist of the New York Stock Exchange.
Mm.
Um, there so there were good people in school with me. We really had a terrific time. So I was in school with some very well-known economists in other fields. Tim Bresnahan, who's an IO economist at Stanford. Joe Altanji was a couple years behind me. At Yale, I didn't quite overlap with Dave Card. I think he came as I was leaving.
Mm-hmm.
But I knew all these guys obviously
Yeah.
from.
Yeah. So what was it like finding a dissertation topic back then? Like compare it to today. What was it like back then?
Well, my personal experience was actually quite interesting. I like to say that my advice from Orly is largely in the form of 2 incredibly valuable 1-hour conversations. Uh, one of which was, I remember I had a meeting with him and one of my other advisors, Al Reese,
Yeah.
who's a very well-known labor economist. I had a fully fleshed out thesis proposal on dispute settlement among public sector workers,
Mm.
which is something I worked on a lot later. I have a strand of my research. And I went and presented it to Orly and Al, and they looked at each other and then looked at me and said, "You don't want to do this."
How come?
They said, maybe it's an inkling of the causal inference thing. They just said, "You're not going to be able to nail this."
Oh.
Um, I had data, I had an idea. I didn't have a fully worked out model.
Mm.
Maybe that was also what they saw.
Mm.
Um, and they said, okay, let's reconvene next week and talk about what you might work on.
Mm.
And I did. That's not the second meeting. This is really one big meeting.
Yeah.
And then we started talking about what am I interested in union behavior, and it was in a give and take dialogue with them that I said I really want to understand how unions work, and we realized that I could perhaps build the literature on modeling unions as maximizing agents, like we model individuals and firms,
Oh.
and that's essentially what I did, and I applied it to the coal miners. And my
Mm.
dissertation was on the wage and employment policy of the United Mine Workers.
What are they maximizing?
Well, if they're maximizing, in my model, I noticed that their contract had really 2 big features. One was it set a wage, and the other was it set important fringe benefits.
Uh-huh.
So they maximize the utility function, which has 3 arguments essentially. It has employment, it has the wage, and it has other benefits. And I
Mm-hmm.
was able to show that older workers prefer more a weight on benefits like health insurance and pensions than
Mhm.
younger workers, so that the policy adopted by the union would move as the age distribution of union membership changed.
Mm,
Now, I did this with 29 observations, so it was a different era.
sure.
Um, and, you know, that, so, and, you know, that was fun. So and it's very different from today. I wrote a dissertation that's not three essays. It's a monograph basically that
Uh-huh.
I published as one short paper in the JPE and one long paper in Research and Labor Economics.
No.
And today, well, two things are true. Every student is different. Most students come to graduate school without a firm interest in what they want to study, other than, oh, I want to be an economist. Me, I wanted to study about labor unions.
Yeah.
So sometimes I get a student with a strong interest like that, and then I try to have conversations with like that with them, like Orly and Al had with me.
Mhm.
For the students who are less directed, I don't give them topics. I say, what are you interested in? Let's talk about that. And
Yeah.
then let's go from there to what you're interested in.
Yeah.
So I've had some amazing students over the years,
Yeah.
and some of whom you've interviewed.
Mhm.
And I gave them their head. I said, tell me what you're interested in. And I'd say, that's a good question. That's not a good question. How are you going to get at that? What are you going to do? And the best students can come up with something. It's pretty rare that I actually had to give a student a topic. I can't hardly remember doing that.
Mhm.
And I used to. I also early on thought wrongly, I think, that students should not write three essays. They should write a monograph.
Mhm.
Uh, but given the publication system in economics with um, journal article length things, I think it was one of my early students, Larry Katz, for whom I broke the rule and never went back. I said, okay, Larry, do three essays. I don't care.
Well, so so you've got a monograph, and so a monograph is your job market paper, or is it totally different back then?
Well, at the time, I was able to do an hour and a half presentation on the project on the wage and employment policy of the United Mine Workers.
Yeah.
And, and I never tried to publish it as a book. I
Mhm.
understood that I needed to publish a good journal article. So I was able to distill the important pieces of it into an article that was appropriate for the JPE.
Yeah.
But then to get the real technical details, I had quite a long paper in Research and Labor Economics
Hmm.
in the late 70s.
Okay.
Uh, and that was so I finished up at Princeton, and there you go.
Well, so you go to MIT. That must have been a real. I mean, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but that's had to have been a little humbling and exciting and all kinds of stuff.
Well, it was like I died and gone to heaven. I mean, it was the best economics department in the world at the time,
Yeah.
and they said, "Come and be one of our labor economists."
Oh, wow.
And I was really, the other labor economist is a guy I respect enormously named Mike Piori, who's a
Uh-huh.
left wing, kind of a more leftist labor economist, and
Yeah.
very candid guy. And we got along well, and we talked together for quite a number of years. And but I got to build the neoclassical field of labor economics at
Ah,
MIT, and so I was able to attract the students who were interested in that and define the field. And I had a lot of students there who are well-known people, and it was it was a good experience. I had terrific colleagues, and I made lifetime friends there.
mm.
So and I was
Was
there for 14 years or so.
Yeah, you get promoted really fast, so you must have been just so you really just hit the ground running, it seems like. You knew how to write, you knew how to do the work well pretty much quickly, it seems like. Did it always come naturally to you?
It doesn't feel like it comes naturally to me now because the work has changed.
Mm,
Um, but back in, I had, I was lucky, I think, the way I viewed things. I don't think I would have been particularly well suited to be Josh Angrist. I mean,
mhm.
Josh is a great friend of mine and he does terrific work, but I have a different approach and set of skills, and it fit for me, and it fit well at MIT at the time. And
Mm,
I I broadened out. I learned stuff. I measure my output, a lot of it through my students. I've had influence on quite a number of people, and that's been quite gratifying.
yeah.
My colleagues at MIT, Bob Gibbons came to MIT and decided he wanted to do labor. So I said, "Come on, Bob, let's," and we talked together and we did stuff and we wrote one of my favorite papers together. And
Mm,
it was a great experience.
yeah.
And so, fundamentally, my approach, I realize in retrospect, while I consider myself an empiricist, I really like the modeling.
Yeah.
And I appreciated in Orley's or early work was there was a real model. And when I've gotten interested in other things, it was about modeling. It was
Yeah.
about, so my work on taxis, which we haven't talked, like I defined my work on the mine workers, I modeled union behavior. My
Hmm.
work on taxi drivers is about distinguishing different economic models.
Hmm.
Um, the I've done work on dispute resolution, like arbitration schemes and bargaining and stuff. And that's all. Even though there's an empirical element in almost all of it, it's really built on models. And
Mm.
that's something that's can get submerged now. So much time is spent establishing identification.
I
You
was just gonna
lose
say, yeah.
you can lose track of what exactly the parameter that you're estimating represents.
Yeah. Yeah.
Again, I'm not dissing the work. I think the
Hmm.
Nobel Prizes are completely well deserved.
Hmm.
And Dave Card is one of my heroes. And it's just, um, what do I feel like I want to do? And
Well, who
it,
was your main community back then? Was it like people like Gary Becker and the labor economists that are mainly writing down models and things like that, or?
I was actually so interested. I had a community at MIT that included there was an industrial relations group
Mm,
in the Sloan School at
mm,
MIT, and I became really close. One guy in particular, named Harry Katz, who eventually became dean of the ILR school at Cornell,
hmm.
is one of my lifelong friends, and we wrote some papers together. At least one paper together on labor arbitration, which
Hmm.
I'm very proud of. And I spent time with Bob McCursey and Tom Kochen at the Sloan School, and I talked some with Jim Medoff and Richard Freeman at Harvard. I would go to the Harvard Labor Workshop and meet with those people, where I met Catherine Abraham,
Mm.
who is, if you haven't interviewed her, you should do that. She's fantastic. She was commissioner of the Bureau of Labor Statistics in the Clinton administration, and she was on the Council of Economic Advisors and so on. And she and I did some work together at MIT when she was an assistant professor in the Sloan School, and we're just
Mm.
now getting together and writing another paper now
Oh,
on
oh.
health insurance and part-time work. So
Well, what about you and Freeman and H. Greg Lewis? Are y'all going back and forth this whole time, kind of writing about you?
no, I have to admit, I don't think I ever developed a warm personal relationship with Richard. Richard was marching to his own drummer, and there was a little bit, wouldn't call it tension, but I never was really part of his operation in the 80s working on labor unions,
Uh-huh.
even though it was in Cambridge. He
Yeah.
was head of the labor group at the NBER, and I wasn't really an important part of that.
Mm.
And I'm not resentful or
Yeah.
anything. I did Right. But Greg Lewis, I met and knew reasonably well, and he's one of my heroes. And when graduate school, I spent an entire summer trying to understand one chapter of unionism and relative wages.
Yeah.
And Dave Card and I joke about this. We understand it's not simple to understand, but he was a really good guy, and Richard
Yeah.
was a great guy. Richard, I always said Richard had a nose for a problem. If I wanted to know what was going to be hot next year, see what Richard's working on now.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
And
Card said that they would joke and they were like, there was a Lewis test, and it was like, if
yeah,
Lewis
the
didn't
smell
believe
test,
the smell test, it was like, if Lewis didn't
absolutely.
believe it, then it wasn't accurate.
That's right, exactly. You
Yeah.
show it to Greg, or you apply the test yourself. My Lewis test is someone brings a result. Do I think this can be true?
Yeah. Right. Right.
Yeah,
Right.
absolutely, absolutely.
So you were in love with you. Is it fair to say, like, you work on unions your whole career? Is like, it's a really meaningful part of your intellectual journey. Is that right? I mean, it's just,
Yes.
yeah. So as the unions kind of declined in overall part of the United States economy, was that, what was that like? I mean, did it feel, did you, I mean, was that a complicated feeling?
Well, it wasn't. It was interesting. I had an intellectual interest in unions. I was sorry to see them decline, but other than saying, "Gee, I better find something else to work on,"
Yeah.
um, I don't think it caused me any emotional harm. I wasn't overtly political in that way,
Uh-huh.
um, but oh, how do I say this? Like I look at what's happening today, and I have to admit, I'm more hopeful in terms of the future of unions and what's going on today
Mm-hmm.
um, than I've been in quite a while. I think
Mm.
the decline of unions is one of the contributing factors toward what I think of as the political mess and social mess we find ourselves in right now. I don't think we want to go into that in any detail, but
I haven't heard
it
anybody ever say that before. The
really,
the unions being a part of the tension. I haven't. I
well,
had.
the lack of unions.
Yeah.
In other words,
What were
if you look
unions?
at, I wrote a paper a couple of years ago with my colleagues Ilyana Kuziemko and Suresh Naidu and
Uh-huh.
Dan Hurst, where we talk about the relationships between unions and inequality. And
Yeah.
what I think is that the dramatic increase in inequality in the U.S. Has sown
Yeah.
the seeds for what we're seeing
Yeah. Right.
in the world. And it's not just in the US. This is true in other countries as well.
Uh-huh.
And what we show in that paper is that the decline of unions is related to the increase in
Ah,
inequality.
I see what you're saying. Oh, interesting. You think that's the only mechanism that it puts some effect on inequality? I mean, are unions also just creating community and solidarity and sort of identity amongst people that would otherwise be really different?
Um,
I mean, it's
it
like
could
it's
be.
what
I haven't thought hard about that. If you think about Putnam's Bowling Alone,
yeah,
and part of what's going on there is the decline of institutions that bring people together.
that's what I'm
Now,
thinking about. Yeah.
different unions play different roles. My father's Teamsters local, I don't think played a big social role,
Mm,
but I believe among the thousands of workers in Linden who worked for General Motors and were members of the UAW, the
hmm.
local was an important gathering place, the local union hall, and so on. And you kind of lose that. The question today is we're seeing now more success organizing auto workers in union unfriendly places
Oh,
that we've seen in a long time in the South, for example.
oh, yeah, yeah.
So there's just a vote this week in Alabama at a Mercedes plant.
Uh-huh.
And I think the results haven't been announced yet. Maybe the polls closed today or something. But the open question is, how well will these successes, will they go beyond the automobile industry? We've had some very visible union bargaining victories.
Hmm.
UPS, the UPS contract, the Screen Actors and Writers Guilds, the big three auto settlement, things like that. And
Yeah.
And people in many parts of the country seem more open to union
Yeah.
organizing. I still think we need policy reform. I still think we need um, the Wagner Act, which was a revolutionary law, the National Labor Relations Act, passed in the 1930s and modified a few times since, um, needs an overhaul to reduce the scope of employers to resist unions.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I was just wondering if people in unions, they might socialize, but I wondered if it actually created identity a little bit, like it's just part of my identity that it's part of my identity that I'm an economist. I feel a certain bond with all economists, even if I'm not socializing with them. And I
Well,
just was wondering, I thought you were kind of saying there's income inequality. I definitely see where you're going with that. But I was also just kind of thinking how many people really feel connected to each other outside of their
yeah,
immediate social community.
yeah. I don't want to speak too much to that because I haven't really studied it, but I
Yeah.
think it makes it, I think it makes sense as
Uh-huh.
a as an idea. I can tell you a story in the 1980s. When I was at MIT, I had a few students who were in the military, who the Army or Air Force had sent to get a PhD in economics, and they were very interested in labor issues. So I advised a few of them. And one of them, after they were done, went to West Point to the military academy to be professor, and they invited me to come give a talk to the cadets.
Hmm.
And I still remember talking informally with the cadets, and one of them was from Detroit, and it was absolutely clear in the household he grew up in, his father and mother thought that everything good in their life came from the union,
Right. Right. Right.
and it was the center of their organization.
Yeah. Yeah.
And you raised a good point that's worth studying. I mean,
Hmm.
one of the things, the other phenomenon that I want to think about, and I don't quite know how to think about it yet, is there's been a marked decline in geographic mobility among Americans. They're much less likely to move interstate, for example, than they used to be.
Mm.
And we don't quite understand why that's true. And, so you read Hillbilly Elegy and you listen to J.D. Vance, not his current political
Yeah.
comments, but
Hmm.
what's in the book. And he said, look, I'm here in Ohio. This is where my family is. This is where our life is. And there's no jobs. We need jobs. We don't want to go somewhere else where we have no community.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
and,
Community's not really portable. It's
but yet there used to be more mobility. And
right. Right.
I don't quite understand why. So there's
Yeah.
lots for younger people to work on.
Well, how did you get interested in this taxi topic? We only have a little bit left time, but how did this even come about?
How did what come about?
Getting interested in taxis, the labor supply
Oh,
of taxi drivers.
well, I'm not sure who the organizers were. I think it was Larry Katz and Bob Gibbons organized a conference on behavioral labor economics
Hmm.
at the NBER West in Palo Alto in the 90s, in the mid 90s, and they invited me to discuss a paper by Kammerer, Babcock, Lowenstein, and Thaler. And I'm a co-author of Babcock's, and I knew the other guys. And I thought it was just a super interesting paper, and that I would have done it very differently.
Hmm.
So that's what my comments were. This is really cool, but here's how you ought to do it.
Uh-huh.
And
They didn't
and
do it they did it their way.
and they did it their way, and I said, and they didn't take my advice. So I consider it a free field. I went and got my own data and started working on it. And
Uh-huh.
what I liked about it is it's set in opposition to each other, two models that both of which I found very appealing.
Yeah.
One was the neoclassical model of labor supply, which
Yeah.
said, if wages rise temporarily, you'll work more to take advantage of that. In
Right.
fact, that's the core insight, so-called, of real business cycle theory,
Uh,
that says we get recessions because real wages fall and people intertemporally substitute leisure for work.
uh-huh.
which Bob Solo said, I don't think my father stopped working in the Depression because he was intertemporally substituted.
Yeah.
But then coming out of the work of Kahneman and Tversky, there was this idea that people had reference points for income.
Yeah.
And then, so if it was a really good day and they could earn money easily, for example, as a taxi driver, you'd set a target for the day and you'd go home early.
Yeah.
Where if it's a tough day when it's hard to make money, you would beat your head against the wall. Just keep working.
Right.
And that's completely the opposite of what the neoclassical model says. You love it when two theories have opposite predictions for something you can observe.
Yeah.
So I got into this and collected my own data. And eventually, by the time my 2015 paper came out, I had data on the complete driving records of every taxi driver in New York for 5 years.
How'd you get that? You approached the taxi driver company or whatever? I don't actually know how it works in New York.
Well, the earlier data I had and the data that Camera et al. Had were just convenience samples that you found a taxi company that gave you some physical trip sheets. But eventually, when they made the records electronic, the Taxi and Limousine Commission in New York maintained a database, which they tended not to make available. But I managed indirectly through my colleague Alan Kruger to meet the U.S. ambassador to the Czech Republic.
Oh my gosh.
Who I had dinner with in Prague. And he said, what are you working on? So I said, I'm working on taxis. He said, oh, one of my really good friends is the chairman of the Taxi and Limousine Commission.
Oh my gosh.
So he did an intro and I went in and met with him and it became possible to get these data.
How big was the data set that you got from him? It's the universe of what? What exactly?
It's every trip taken in every yellow cab in New York for 5 years.
Oh my gosh.
900 million trips.
Wow. Wait, when did you, what year is this? There's the 08 and there's the 2015 paper. So which one?
This is for the 2015 paper. The data I have cover 2009 to 2013 were the data I had. And
what are you using? What computer you're using? Like these servers?
There's something I need to say here though, if you don't mind.
Yeah.
Shortly after that, well, two things happened. Uber and Lyft came in.
Yeah.
And that complicated the market. We had no data on that. But more importantly, the Taxi and Limousine Commission worried that someone could hack their data and identify individual drivers.
Yeah.
So they removed all the IDs from the data. So you no longer can get the data that identify who the driver is or what cab they're driving, which means you can't really study their labor supply.
You can't, or no one else can. You had it.
No one can.
But you had it.
I had it for a set of years.
Yeah.
But no later data is available. So if you wanted to study Uber and Lyft and how that affected things, it's impossible to do.
I see. Right. Do you use some kind of natural experiment where you're like exogenously varying the external wage or something like that? Is that what you want to do? You want to like exogenously vary the wage?
Well, there are some things that there are demand shifts that are exogenous, like holidays have lower demand, and there was a change in the fare at a particular date that was exogenous, and I handle all of those appropriately. I don't just tend to use the nomenclature of the
natural experiment
of the ID people.
Yeah. Right. So you've got things that are shifting the demand curve to get that exogenous variation.
Yeah, I've got plenty of things shifting the demand curve, time of day, which moves around, and so on. So I've got plenty of variation. I don't think that's the issue. I do use IV because the main problem with what a lot of people have done is they've run a regression of hours worked on hourly earnings during the day, but hourly earnings is income divided by hours. So you're regressing hours on the inverse of hours, and if there's any misspecification or measurement error, you're going to get bias. And we have a way to deal with that. Anyway,
what did you end up finding? What was your main finding from it?
The main finding was that the behavioral stuff, there's really not much support for it in those data, in the sense that almost all the variation in daily hours comes from, is what I'll call consistent with the neoclassical model.
Mm.
And my understanding, new drivers, a fair number of new drivers seem to behave in the way that says they have a target.
Yeah.
But those drivers tend to quit the business.
Right.
Because if you think about it, if you don't behave neoclassically, it's just harder to earn a living as a taxi driver because you're going home early on days when it's easy to make money.
Yeah.
And these are not great jobs. You're not earning that much money.
Mm.
And it's just damn hard.
Yeah.
So two things happen. New drivers either A, leave, or B, learn. I actually have evidence that they learn to be more, what I'll call more neoclassical.
With experience over time.
With experience. And it happens pretty quickly. It actually happens pretty quickly.
Oh.
But I have so much data, I can identify new drivers and I can identify how their behavior changes over time.
That's a big jump from 29 observations to 900 million observations.
Yes.
You're not using punch cards for that. That's wonderful. I have one more question, then I'm going to let you go because you've been wonderful. I was looking at your Wikipedia page and the genealogy.
I have a Wikipedia page. I've never seen it.
You do, yes. You have a Wikipedia page, and it's got dissertation advisor, orally, and then it had 6 of your students. And one of them, at least one of them's no longer with us, and it was Becky Blank, Larry Katz, Kevin Lang, Erica Field, and William Dickens. And I just was wondering, for the sake of the people that are listening, if you just tell us a little bit about Dr. Blank and what she was like as a student.
Well, she was one of the people who came in and knew what she was interested in.
Uh-huh.
I mean, she was a serious competitive debater. So she talked more quickly than almost anyone I'd met. She was really smart, pretty teched up, and just told me what she was going to work on. But then, not in focused way, but in the area of public policy and poverty. And she, in fact, did a study. Her dissertation work was really on whether poor people moved to states with more generous welfare benefits, which was a big criticism of making welfare benefits more generous, was we'll get an influx, and that's a very hard technical problem, especially with the computing of the early 1980s.
Yeah.
And she was just a delight, became a lifelong friend. I was at her wedding. I'm going to meet her husband. I'm going to see her husband next week. He's a Princeton alum and is coming back for reunions. And having students like Becky, like Larry, you've missed a few of them, like Paul Oyer, who you interviewed, was one of my students.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
And Bill Dickens was fabulous. Having these students is, I would say that's going to have more lasting impact than my work, is what impact I had on these students. But Becky was a delight to work with, was super motivated. I wish I could bottle her intensity and her focus.
Well, it's really been a wonderful, I've kept you longer than you'd given me, so I really appreciate your generosity with your time. I want to just end with this. Somewhere out there's this young labor economist that, maybe they're not like you and they're not like Dr. Blank. They're not positive. They know they want to be in labor, but they don't really know what their topic is. And I wonder what is it, the kind of things that you just sort of generally sort of think that person right now, you'd like them to hear after having seen so many different kinds of students and so many different kinds of labor economists over the years?
Well, I mean, how would I get them to focus on something they'd be interested in?
Or just what do you think the message that you'd like to just sort of leave to somebody like that's out there not sure?
I would say, pick up a newspaper almost any day, and you'll see problems that economists can really contribute to understanding. What are the big issues of the day? Think about immigration. My colleague Leah Bustan is one of the experts on immigration. She was a student of mine when she was an undergrad here at Princeton. And she developed this interest in immigration later. But I would say, what interested you in the paper this morning?
Yeah.
That economists might have something to say. And I'm not talking about Trump's trial in New York. I'm talking about, real problems like immigration, like international trade, and trade restrictions. Should we have trade restrictions? What should we do about, the tariffs, for example, that were just announced this week on imported electric vehicles that were just increased. What does that mean for labor in the U.S.? What does it mean for capital? But more importantly, for labor, we're labor economists,
Right?
And I would say that solving, despite some of the examples in my work, solving a very focused technical problem is useful, but not to me necessarily as interesting, unless the technical problem is critical for learning something important about the world.
And that's the part you're saying about reading the newspaper. It's thinking about what's important for the world.
Well, and what interests you, because you're going to spend a tremendous amount of your time working on this thing. And if you're not excited about it, no one else is going to be excited about it. I look at our graduate students here now, and I'm really not advising anymore in any formal sense, but we have some students working on really terrific stuff. One of them working on, what is the effect of having employer-provided health insurance on low-skilled workers when insurance is very expensive compared to what they're making in the first place?
Yeah.
We have another one looking at very much inspired, I think, by Leah's work, is a student looking at World War II Navy veterans and who they served with on their ship and whether that affected their future outcomes and where they located, which I find super fascinating because I think location decisions are very important, getting back to my earlier comment about decline in migration.
Yeah. Oh, that's fascinating. Well, that's great. Well, Dr. Farber, it's really been nice to get to talk to you. I really appreciate you giving me your time and your life story. You let me just hear an hour of it. So neat. And thank you so much for being on the show.
All right. Well, thank you for having me. I really enjoyed it.
Good.